All right, I think we're live. Let's see if this thing works. I'm going to be waiting just a little bit to make sure that everybody is coming. Don't want to cut off any late stragglers. So, how's everybody doing? It's my first time doing a YouTube live stream, but I think it'll go out fine. So, so for those of you who are just subscribing to this channel, please subscribe to the channel. And also, be sure to press the bell button right beside the channel button on YouTube. That way you get notifications whenever I release a new video or live stream, so that way you don't miss anything, because, you know, that wouldn't be fun. Alrighty, so give it about another minute. And if you want to follow me on social media, the only place where I am right now, I'm on YouTube, and you can also, I'm on YouTube, but you can also follow me on Facebook. I'm at Jackson E. Graham Author, and you can also sign up to my email newsletter on my website. And of course, I won't spam your inbox. I only send out emails every once in a while, but you'll be the first to know if there's any new releases or developments. Alrighty, so. Okay, so I think I'm going ahead and get started. All right, so as everybody knows, I'm Jackson E. Graham, the author of the Sword and Scion series. So before we get started into this live stream, I want to address a few housekeeping remarks. Excuse me. So just a reminder, if you're interested in the $10 Amazon gift card drawing, you want to go to the chat window and type "drawing" into the chat. All caps helps. And the drawing will be closed for entries at 7 p.m. and the winners will be announced during the Q&A following the presentation. And then those two winners will be contacted by email and sent an e-gift card via email. And the drawing will be done through randompicker.com. And feel free to send any questions to the chat window during the presentation. The moderator will be delivering these to me as I can address them after the presentation. And this is the first time I've done a YouTube live stream. So in case something happens and the live stream ends, you can just go to my channel, Jackson E. Graham Author at YouTube, and wait to see the new live stream in the videos section where you can rejoin. Just want to make that clear, just in case something goes horribly wrong and people need to rejoin. And I also have another two announcements. So for those of you who don't know, I'm actually starting a podcast. So it's called The Novelists Guild. It's geared toward young writers wanting to grow more in their craft. And it's available on Spotify, Anchor, and it should be on Stitcher, and it will be on Apple Podcasts in a few hours. And there's also on my website a free map pack for new subscribers. So if you already have subscribed to my website, you can resubscribe and get the little password that allows you to download the map pack. And don't worry, you will not receive duplicate emails if you resubscribe to my email list. So I just want to make sure everybody got that before we deal with anything further. Okay, so tonight I'm going to be kind of addressing and discussing the idea of historical appreciation in writing. So I'll start with a quote. "The most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history." So when we think of historical appreciation, we might be tempted to kind of ask, why is it even important? Or what do I mean by the word appreciation? So when I'm talking about appreciation, I'm not talking about endorsing everything the culture or historical character is known for. But rather appreciating what I can take inspiration from, reference, learn from, or use as a testing ground for my writing ideas. So using it as a place of inspiration. And is it irrelevant? Well, I would say no, because writers have the unique task of not only entertaining their audience, that's pretty obvious, but passing down appreciation for history and culture to the next generation, as well as the lessons we've learned from history. Because people are formed somewhat by cultural events, history, and the echoes of that are felt for generations. and they inform why people think the way they do and behave the way they do. So being ignorant of history ends up setting traps to catch us. So if you're an author, that trap could be accidentally offending your readers. Of course, the truth will always be offensive to some, but if there's a chance you can frame something in a different way or deliver it differently, people might have be more willing to hear what you have to say. So, with that said, today's trend of rewriting history is actually kind of alarming. It reminds me of Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, where rewriting history is they rewrite history to make everything pleasurable and eliminate all opposing views and things that are considered offensive. If we're going to go to history again to find an example of this, we could find an example in ancient Egypt. Akhenaten was nearly wiped out from Egyptian history due to his controversial views, but there's only a few historical artifacts that remain to point to Akhenaten's existence. So again, writers are responsible for communicating the reality and lessons of history, because we've all heard the saying, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and that's pretty undesirable. I'm pretty sure we don't want to repeat all the bad things that have gone on in history. It's better to learn from others, both the pluses and the minuses. One of our presidents said, each generation goes further than the generation preceding it because it stands on the shoulders of that generation. So how does a writer approach this historical appreciation? It might seem a bit of an interesting concept. But before I launch quite into that, I actually want to read a section from Sword and Scion Book 4, The Court of Extravagant Secrets. Let me find my place here. Here we go. The Vale of Toothros lived up to its name, the Vale of Clutter. On either side of the valley, broken shards of rock littered the steep slopes. The distant howl of wolves echoed on the winds, and the caw of crows joined in harmony. As Hayron surveyed the road ahead, the wild terrain made their strategic retreat to Gahydros seem like banishment. As they passed through the final stone corridor, the rocky hillsides veered into a wider course before falling away altogether into a tract of open heath. Ahead stretched endless fields of faded green, dotted with specks of purple heather. Farms began to appear on the horizon, clustering together in ever-growing villages. Rollin gave a sharp command, and a party of horsemen stormed across the plains, leaving the mountainous vale behind for the highlands that lay ahead. Hayron's eyes sparkled as he glimpsed the outline of a distant structure coming into view. Nestled within a semicircle of trees, Castle Gahydros rivaled the splendor of Mithlon with an ancient grandeur that stood the test of time. Gahydros spread across the ground like the roots of a birch, clinging to the ancient heritage birthed in the soil. Before its high walls, the shimmer of a deep moat caught Hayron's eye, and tall spires rose skyward like royal flags in procession. As they drew near to the castle, Rollin drew a horn from its place at his side and blew a blast of greeting. The echoing welcome of horns rang out from the ramparts in return. With the sharp clang of metal, the drawbridge bowed in homage at the approach of the Lord of Gahydros. No sooner had the bridge dropped into place than the party of riders galloped like a flash through the arched gateway. Pulling back on the reins, Hayron slowed his steed to a trot along with Nathan and Rollin. The courtyard grounds were unusually spacious. According to history, the warrior founders of Gahydros had purposely arranged the castle to accommodate their unwieldy lances. Within the confines of the castle walls, a large, round building rivaled the size and grandeur of Gahydros' keep. A circular roof sloped above it, and drops of rain glistened as they rolled off its edges. The structure's wide doorway swung open, and Hayron stared, mouth agape, as mounted knights sallied forth to patrol the moors, their tapered banners fluttering in defiance against the light rain. The knights ushering forth were unmistakable. Their kite shields boasted traditional Adevran knightly crests, flora and bright artwork, set against contrasting shades of light and dark. In the overcast daylight, their plate armor glowed, yet few were free of the scars of conflict. Seeing Heron smile, Roland laughed and sidled beside him as the Knights of the Lance paraded. Gahydros is loyal to the traditions of the past, he said. I do not believe an enemy could escape our vigilance. A whinny from Nathan's horse broke through the haze of Heron's wonder. Glancing about, the hero of Alathel nodded in the direction of the keep. A fear-vigilant eye is not enough in our predicament, he remarked. He caught Heron's uneasy glance. You have both the vigilance and keen mind we need, Heron. The guide will lead you to use it well, he encouraged, glancing up at the ramparts hemming them in. But we must hurry inside. Should we be followed, I do not wish to give our foe an opportunity to spot us. But the eyes of their enemy had already riveted upon them. Cliffhanger, but I'm not going to tell you what happens. You'll have to read the book for that. So, the first part where historical appreciation comes into play as a writer is through firsthand experience. Now, as a fantasy author, it's pretty clear that we don't have time machines that rocket us to the Middle Ages, although that would be a very helpful researching tool. But there are Renaissance fairs, and I've gone to several throughout my life. I've watched jousting where, actually, I watched jousting not too long ago. I believe it was last summer. And it was really cool to see the poles. They would hit each other, and then they would flex and bend and splinter in this spray of sparks. And even some competitors were actually unable to fight because the horses were not cooperative. They were being skittish. And of course, in a Renaissance fair, you get up close and personal with armor and weapons, and you really feel immersed in the culture and feel of the period. And actually, this is one of the main reasons why I was sparked with interest and excitement and passion for the Middle Ages when I was younger, was going to these Renaissance fairs as well as doing multiple activities at home during homeschool, which was always fun. Another way I've had firsthand experience is actually, I mentioned this in the book launch trailer for, the book launch for book 1 on my YouTube channel, where I actually rode on a tall ship known as the Hawaiian Chieftain. There's more information on the Hawaiian Chieftain and Gray's Harbor Historical Seaport on that video. It's going to be the book launch for Sword and Scion Book 1. But it was really cool just to feel the wind surge through the sails and the bow rise and fall over the waves and the ocean spray smack you in the face. And there was actually even a fake pirate attack. So it was pretty cool to look over in the distance and see the pirates shooting cannons at us, although it was really, blanks. They're not really shooting cannons at us. Another place where I've kind of had first-hand experience was last summer. Me and my family went to Leavenworth, and there was a Russian store there that was that showed various products from old Russia. So you have a lot of that traditional lacquer art, the beautiful designs, and I actually incorporated some of that medieval Russian art feel into book 4, so you can see some of those elements. And actually, I'm going to read a section for you guys where you can see that firsthand. There we go. They rounded the corner. An oak door barred the way, and the guards watching over it fixed their helmeted gaze upon them. Their gauntleted hands clutched halberds, and extravagant shields nearly hid them from view. Recognizing Nathan, they lifted their halberds in salute and clashed their gauntlets on their shields. One of them seized the ornate doorknobs and heaved the doors open with a quiet word of welcome. With a nod of courtesy, Heron passed by Nathan and entered with a boldness that strove to make up for his growing uneasiness. The banquet hall's expanse yawned about them with a grandeur that complemented the pomp of its patrons. The din of idle conversation resounded off the high ceiling and vast walls, and the size of the crowd seemed to double by sound alone. Servants kept to the outskirts, going about their duties with the quiet humility of their position. Only the sound of clinking utensils and plates hinted at their presence. Pillars at the corners of the banquet hall supported the cathedral roof. Deep green designs were painted upon the white walls to enliven them with the same beauty that pervaded the rest of the castle. A massive fireplace was inset into one of the walls. emitting a steady wave of heat into the room. Hayron stared at the lavish outfits of the guests. The men boasted richly stitched outer coats, some trimmed with a strip of fur around the cuffs. The women's long dresses draped to the floor. Hayron blinked as his eyes struggled to take in the complexity of their intricate embroidery and stitching. Elaborate headdresses strapped precariously to the women's heads, shaped like inverted crescents or wide fans. Suppressing a smile at their exaggerated hats, Hayron cleared his throat. The doors to the banquet hall closed, and the guests turned in greeting. At the sight of Hayron, they hesitated. The youth before them appeared too young for the heroic Scion they had envisioned. Under their intense scrutiny, Hayron stiffened, his iron gaze intensifying as he fought to keep from blushing. Poor guy. A little bit of an awkward situation for him. As you might have noticed, I mentioned these headdresses, and I actually got to see some of those in person at the Leavenworth store, where these beaded headdresses that were, I mean, the ones that I saw in person were pretty, but I've seen some older photos, black and white photos, that were way bigger, and it was pretty cool, pretty good inspiration for that, as well as seeing some old photos of, like, more medieval Russian outer coats for the men. And so on the cover of Sword and Scion Book 4, you can see some of these headdresses there. In fact, these were the ones that were in the Leavenworth store. I took a picture of it, and we ended up incorporating it into the cover. So pretty cool historical point there. It's a historical element that I ended up including. So in that scene I just read, we see a character struggling with culture shock as he is immersed in a very different setting than what he's used to. And because of his status, he's obliged to learn how to engage in and interpret this new culture. And I'm not going to tell you what his new status is. That's going to be a little bit of something you have to find out when you read the book. So also in the storyline, the characters are trying to appeal to a sense of history and nostalgia of the better times in hopes of reviving a desire for more noble ideas again. So, longing for the old days when things were so much better. Even though in history it doesn't always turn out to be as great as we imagine it to be, but there are definitely some things that we can learn from history and appreciate that have been lost in our modern culture. Now, secondly, as a writer, how do I approach historical appreciation is in research. So, I use world building inspired by historical events and elements, as you've kind of seen with the Russian clothing and headdresses. Because with history, inspiration is free for the taking. There's nothing barring you from using history freely as inspiration for your writing. And it's just a matter of integrating your story world and ideas into your story. And I don't just take surface material, although there's plenty of abundance of that regarding different cultures in the world, but I also try to find out how the world works and has worked historically. So, for example, the feudalism in Sword and Scion, although, to be fair, the true medieval feudalism and the feudalism demonstrated in Sword and Scion do have some differences. And for those of you who don't know what feudalism is, I'll kind of just give you a basic idea. So the kings own the land, and they divide it among the greater lords, and who then parcel it down to the lesser lords, and then those lesser lords divide it among the serfs that work the land and are bound to it. So, unlike true medieval feudalism, I make no mention of serfdom in Sword and Scion, and there are typically more freedoms granted to the commoners. And of course, part of this is because my characters are not commoners, so naturally I don't dwell on the situation of the common folk. Also, the word baron is actually the lowest form of British nobility in real life. And the term lord is actually not a rank, but a form of address. For example, if you're a baron, people wouldn't address you as Baron, insert name here. They would address you as Lord, your name. However, in my story, in my world, in Alafel, a baron is considered the highest form of nobility under the king, and the title lord is actually a rank given to the lower nobility of any given territory. And a given territory in Alafel is the equivalent of a medieval thief. Also, I haven't just included feudalism as an example of integrating history into my stories, but I also have studied what we call the cycle of nations, which is Sir Alex Fraser Tytler is responsible for creating this cycle of nations, which frames my understanding of civilization's rise and fall. So basically, it categorizes the different steps of a civilization's birth to its demise and how it's sucked up into a new cycle of nations. So the first step would be bondage, then moving down to spiritual faith, which actually a good example of this would be the children of Israel in the Bible. So they were enslaved by the Egyptians, which is the bondage step, the first step of the cycle of nations. They moved to spiritual faith, which you can see in the Bible with Moses. And from that spiritual faith comes great courage, these great virtues, these heroic virtues we see a lot in old literature. And from that great courage comes liberty, so freedom. And this is where the children of Israel have been liberated from the Egyptians, and they've crossed the Red Sea, and everything seems to be good. But due to that liberty, abundance comes, which isn't bad in itself, but eventually ends up leading to the next step, which is selfishness. Because, granted, whenever we experience abundance as humans, we have a tendency to gorge ourselves on that abundance and be overly selfish. And from that selfishness comes complacency, where we don't really care about what's going on around us. We're more content with what we're doing, and the stuff that we're going around in the outside world doesn't seem nearly as much of a problem. And then that progresses to apathy, where we outright dismiss what's going on in the world around us, which therefore gives birth to dependency on another power. And then once you rely on a power too much, that other power you rely on will end up taking you over, which results back into step one, which is bondage. So you can kind of see the idea of a cycle of where a nation rises, falls, it's absorbed into another one, and the cycle continues on. And this actually will come into play in Sword and Scion, mostly books 5 and 6, but in book 4, the Alethel has started to degrade into the later stages of the cycle of nations, so you can kind of guess where that's going in the Sword and Scion series, but I'm not going to actually spoil anything for you. So you'll have to find out what happens in the next book. So I'm actually going to read another reading for you guys. Let's see where it is. With a sharp clink, the doors to Mithlon's great library swung inward. At the sight of Rosine and Nathan, the guard beside the entry inclined his head in courtesy. He glimpsed Hayren and Mark and hesitated, shooting a questioning glance toward the two nobles. Nathan raised a hand to assure the man. They pose no threat to policy. Both are guests of honor in my care, and as such, have full authorization to enter, he said. The sentry bowed in compliance and gestured for the two squires to enter. Hayren coughed at the pungent scent of incense, and his boots sunk into the carpet. Inset in the far wall, a gated fireplace labored to preserve the comfort of the library's patrons. Between the ceiling's web of transepts, painted scenes instilled Adevran history with a new life. Dressed in ornate finery, the many librarians scurried up the grand staircases to the multiple levels of bookshelves and study alcoves, organizing and cleaning as they made their rounds. Bronze pediments with decorative finials crowned each bookshelf, and carved signage indicated the subject matter for each section. Windows and chandeliers worked in harmony to illuminate the great library's glory, but it was the books themselves that proved the most striking adornment, their spines of brown, red, and tan like an earthy canvas. Hayren gaped at the grandeur. The simple elegance of Osdale's modest library was overshadowed by the magnificence of Mithlon's great library. Several librarians stood from behind a nearby desk, bowing to Nathan and Rosine in respect. Long, flowing dresses made them seem as if they drifted across the floor like loose pages in the wind. At the sight of Hayren, the head librarian smiled, her status indicated by the owl pendant around her neck. "Welcome, Hayren Winrance," she said. "It is an honor to have you among these hallowed shelves." Hayren smiled uneasily, feeling her gaze drift across his formal attire. From the flash of humor in her eyes, it was clear she noticed his discomfort. Eyes narrowed in his single-minded quest, Nathan roved the multiple stories with his gaze. Chancellor Leophas? He inquired. Though he appeared composed, he clasped his hands tightly behind his back to curb his urgency. The head librarian pointed to the nearest staircase. He's in the furthest study alcove, on the uppermost level, she said. At Nathan's appreciative smile, she inclined her head with a good-natured twinkle in her eye. Rosine shot an uncertain glance to the great library's closed doors. Can we trust you to keep our presence a secret? She said, choosing her words carefully. Shaking her head, the librarian held up a hand to dissuade her concern. The utmost discretion, my lady, she insisted. We never breach the trust of our patrons. With a gracious bow to the librarians, Nathan strode across the great library's expanse, with the others trailing behind. As their footsteps echoed upon the marble stairs, Heron squirmed with the fractured stillness. Several librarians moved aside to let them pass, bowing in respect for their guests before moving on. Heron peered off into the obscure corners of the library, flanking Rosine and Nathan with Mark. He remembered Nathan's private words to him upon their arrival. A library is a haven for the burdened pilgrim. This is a place for searching, not hunting. Though he understood Nathan's sentiments, Heron wasn't convinced. The untroubled atmosphere of the great library seemed fragile. He felt for the dagger concealed within his outer coat. Mark furtively glanced over his shoulder to study a librarian that lingered behind them. The shared foreboding was evident in his probing look. As they crested the stairs, Mark and Heron both moved in front of Nathan and Rosine to shield them. Along the edge of the library's uppermost level, a walkway guided patrons down rows of bookshelves. Study alcoves were set at various intervals along the walls, retreating into secluded havens for undisturbed study. Standing before a shelf, one of the patrons unknowingly strayed into their path, his head in a book. As they weaved around the man, Mark moved to shield Nathan, his hand on his concealed dagger. With a small lift of his hand, Nathan waved him off. The small group stopped before an arched entryway of polished wood. As they entered the alcove, bookshelves encompassed them like a silent council. Antiquities awaited study with patience, chained to the shelves like prisoners on display. The pleasant light of latticed windows was darkened by a domineering shadow. So, as you might have noticed, this is a pretty big library I'm mentioning in Book 4. And I actually partly based this off of the Great Library of Alexandria. For those of you who don't know about the Great Library of Alexandria, it basically was the Greeks, when they conquered well, let's just put it this way. The Greeks decided to make a huge library full of all the world's wisdom. So I was inspired by that idea of gathering knowledge from all over the earth, from all the corners of the world. And I integrated that feel of a massive collection of knowledge, in addition to a large staff and a mysterious, mystical atmosphere, since we don't really know what happened to the Great Library of Alexandria. So I thought I might include that sort of feeling of mystery into Book 4. Other places where I've kind of used history as inspiration for various events was in Book 2. You might remember the attempt on Thros Ravenstrong's life. I actually based that scene off of the Medici church ambush. So I did a lot of research on the Italian noble family, the Medicis, and there was a really interesting and very climactic moment where they're all ambushed by their enemies in this church service, and I kind of based that attempt on Thros' life off of that historical event. And in Book 3, I based Norgalok. Norgalok ended up having a sort of Viking-esque culture with full of paganism and sea raiders, and as clearly I took that from Viking history. And again, this is just a few examples of how history proves an endless wellspring of ideas and for plot events and even characters. Because it's true what Chesterton said. There is no such thing on Earth as an uninteresting subject. The only thing that can exist is an uninterested person. So thank you all for coming, and now I'm open for Q&A. And again, before we move on, I want to definitely say, for those of you who read any of the books in the Sword and Scion series, Amazon reviews are much appreciated. Self-published authors need reviews to kind of spread the word and get their books up there into the Amazon algorithm. So all reviews are appreciated. All right, so the book link for Sword and Scion Book 4 has just been posted into the chat window. And all right, so we got a question from Ashley. Will there be a new soundtrack for this book? Well, I'm actually working on the Sword and Scion soundtrack during quarantine. So again, I'm taking into account my whole series as I'm making the soundtrack. So there will be songs from all of the books in the album that I'm hoping to release. So yes, there are some songs relating to book 4 that will end up coming in. And we also have a question from Reed. Who's your favorite character? That's like asking a parent what's their favorite child. That's not a very easy question to answer. So I would say I daydream about a lot of my characters. I mean, that's a hard question. Honestly, I really like Heron. I've had a lot of ideas of what I could do with his story and where I could take him. I've had ideas about Gwendol. As strange as this sounds, I have ideas for Gibasil. I just love thinking about Gibasil and the Griffins, because even though they're animals, they are kind of characters in their own right. So, but again, I kind of have a bit of me in all of my characters, so I really am attached to all of them in some way or form. So, in regards to Heron, I had an idea of what I kind of wanted him to be like. For example, in Sword and Scion Book 3, The Reign of Delusion, I had kind of fleshed him out as a child and kind of what his personality would end up looking like if I developed it further, planting the seeds for a future character. So I went back to Book 3 and I kind of reacquainted myself with some of those concepts and ideas of, he's he's a man of few words, he's laconic, he's very simple in his way of thinking. And I ended up taking that and fleshing that out more in Book 4 and fleshing him out into a more deeper, more dimensional character, if that makes any sense. So yeah, he's a fun character to write, and yeah. All right, we got one question from Slugger, excuse me. Will there be any big axes used by any of your characters? Well, not in book 4 there aren't really axes, but again, I like to incorporate lots of different medieval weaponry into my books. It's one of my fascination with medieval history is going over the weapons. So even when I'm not writing, I kind of read articles about medieval weapons and watch videos about them. So I kind of absorb that information in my free time. So I try to integrate what I've learned and what I like in medieval weaponry into my books. Okay, we got a question from Puget Sound PS. What was the hardest scene to write? Man, that's a bit of a hard. It's a hard question. This book was kind of hard to write on a lot of different levels because there was a lot of things I was trying to juggle at once. Maybe not as much as book 2, but it was very interesting to see how different things related to each other. And I wanted the theme of book 4 to be a strong one. So that was one of the hardest parts for me to work on in Sword and Scion Book 4 was getting the theme hashed out and right. And of course, there ended up being scenes that needed to be rewritten or added, and some stuff that needed to be taken away. So in all reality, there was more than one hard scene to write, and I think most of the hardness and difficulty, of that came from having to assemble this puzzle together from a grander scope. So yeah, it's being a writer is hard work. All right, we have a question from Micah. How did you decide which cultures to use in the story? So it varies. So for example, in book 3, it was I had already established the idea in book 2 of there being sea raiders from Norglock, so I ended up kind of taking that and saying to myself, okay, that's where Viking culture needs to come in with Sea Raiders. So I ended up kind of doing a spin off that and it ended up working to my benefit. And then book 4, I wanted a more civilized, advanced culture in Adevros because little tidbit for my fans. In Alethel, Adevros is the oldest territory that was adopted into the kingdom of Alethel. So naturally, because it's the oldest territory, the first territory that was adopted into the kingdom, it's naturally going to be a more advanced. So I wanted to have that more refined feel where civilization seems to be progressing out of the early Middle Ages into the late and maybe even the Renaissance. So that's where some of that Russian feel came from, was just seeing how exquisite and fine all their art was in medieval Russia that ended up integrating that kind of back to support that feel of sophistication and cultural advancement. So again, it varies. I mean, there's a little bit of cultures and a lot of different things for like Osdale and Tegohar, more Celtic-ish, sunny Celtic. Book 2 with Rehalan, there was a little bit of Viking influence as well as just typical medieval. So again, it kind of just depends on where I'm trying to go with the story. The culture that I'm trying to portray in my world building is meant to support the story. So, I got another question. What ideas do you have for future series? Any spin-offs? I actually do want to do I want to do spin-off short stories. I have some ideas and maybe some novellas that I want to do because I have another trilogy, I believe, planned out for once Sword and Scion is finished. It's not going to be in the same universe, but I want to end up doing that. And of course, I love Alethel and Sword and Scion so much that I want to I want to stay in there as long as possible. So it's going to be kind of sad when this series is finished. So I'm going to be releasing short stories, I believe, set in Alethel, kind of exploring some more of the world. I got a question from Ashley. How did you come up with the overall concept for the series? So Sword and Scion originated back in NaNoWriMo, my second NaNoWriMo. And I had read a lot of John Flanagan's Ranger's Apprentice series, and also Lord of the Rings. So I wanted to have that sort of questing feel where there's just this world where they're going on adventures and not episodic, but each book kind of deals with its own individual adventure. So that concept kind of is still the driving force behind a lot of this, although I'm also trying to weave into like a grander story behind all of what's going on with this. Each book has its own adventure, but there's an overarching story that's going on over top of everything. So that's sort of, and of course, like I've said before, I love the Middle Ages, so naturally that comes into my stories as well. Question from Douglas. Did Gibisil heal up from his wounds? Many are very, very protective of Gibby. Yeah, so you'll find out in book 4, he doesn't grow another eye back. Sorry if there's anybody here who hasn't read book 3. I apologize. Just forget what I just said. But you'll kind of see how that injury plays in as the series progresses. And yes, I'm sorry for everybody that was sad when Gibisil got, because that made me a little sad too when I wrote it. And it's funny to me when people come up to me and say, "Why did you do that?" Because it's both like, I'm sorry, but yet I'm not sorry, because that means that I did a good job. But so Puget Sound PS asks, how would you describe book 4 in one sentence? I would describe it as the Court of Extravagant Secrets. That's how I would describe it. The title kind of sums it up. There's a lot of extravagance that's going on, and also some mysterious things going on that kind of add that tension and feel of, oh no, something bad's going to happen. So actually, I think the book title would be a good one-liner sentence to describe the book. Jamila H. asks, in this stage of the series, how old are the main characters? So, Aeolus is in his late 20s. Hayward is going to be about 15. Gwendol, I think she's in her late 20s to early 30s. Those are the main characters, and that's how old they are. Gibisil, I never really actually described what age he was when they met him in book 1. So, as for right now, his age is yet undetermined. Although we know that he is, I mean, animals don't live forever, so we can assume that he's not, like 50 years old. John asks, did you have a general plan for each book when you started this series, or did you start with book 1 and then it grew? Well, let's see. I mean, book 1, I had the idea during NaNoWriMo for what I wanted for books 1 through 3 of the Sword and Science series, but the series evolved a whole lot during that process. So, for example, book 2, I knew that the villain was not going to be revealed until later in the book, but I didn't actually have it fleshed out on how I was going to do that. So a lot of the political intrigue and that sort of mystery feel of book 2 came during the writing of book 2. So I had a general idea for books 1 through 3, like where they would happen, what would technically go on, and where setting wise they would take place. But now with book 4, I haven't had any nano drafts, so pretty much I'm writing these things out of thin air now, with no previous inkling of what I want. Although, I mean, I have brainstorming notes, but other than that, I don't have like a full first draft to go off of. LG asks, is there plate armor or chainmail in your books? And the answer is yes. So I do have lots of chainmail in my books. You might have noticed. For readers of Sword and Science series, you might have noticed the amount of mention of chainmail. So a lot of the armor typically in Sword and Science in Alethel is chainmail. Is mostly made of chainmail with pieces of plate armor here and there. In Adevros, in book 4, I do make mention of there actually being full suits of plate armor. So we typically think of knights in shining armor. Those big armor-plated suits did not come up into play until the late Middle Ages, almost to the Renaissance. So again, I wanted Adevros to be that old territory of Alethel. So naturally, I wanted to have everything I could be more advanced. So, for example, the armor moved past chainmail and pieces of plate armor to actual full-body plate armor. So, Reed asks, one moment here. Who's your inspiration for your bad guys, for my villains? It depends on the book. I don't base any of these villains on people I know, so that's always good. And and even if they were, I wouldn't tell anybody. But they basically, it honestly depends on what I'm shooting for in the book. So, for example, I wanted that sort of classic fantasy feel. So, having an evil overlord sort of villain like Scion ended up being the villain I wanted, so I ended up writing him accordingly. Book 2, I'm not going to tell you who the villain is, just in case if somebody here has not read book 2. But I wanted that villain to be conniving and sneaky, and you don't think you know who he is at the point. So again, the needs of the book fit the villain, although it kind of is an interesting process because the villain sometimes comes first before the rest of the book develops, and then the book follows the villain. So it's a little bit of a mishmash depending on what comes first. But typically, I'll be going with what theme am I going for, what world am I going for, and then what sort of villain plays off of that. Or more often than not, though, I believe the villain will come first in at least some sort of crude, basic form. And then once I have that basic idea, I put him in my book, him or her in my book, and then I flesh them out into something bigger there. And just a reminder, for those of you who want, excuse me, to want to get that free map pack I talked about, and you've already subscribed to my channel, you already subscribed to my email list, you can go ahead and resubscribe. You'll get an email with the password used to download the map pack, but you don't have to worry about there being duplicate emails. I won't send you an email twice because you've resubscribed. Everything will be fine. You'll only receive one email every time I send everything out. And basically, you just go to my website. There will be a pop-up that says, join my email list, and then you put your email in there, and you get everything else. And I got a question from Micah. Which character are you most emotionally attached to? Oh, man. All of them? Can I say that? Can I say that I'm attached to all of them? All my main characters I'm pretty attached to. I mean, Hayron I'm attached to, AOS I'm attached to, Gwendol I'm attached. I mean, there's a lot of fun characters in my series that I really have enjoyed writing, so I'm attached to them. And it's funny is that I always it seems every book I write ends up coming with some sort of a sense of loss because for those of you who've read my series so far, you've noticed that there's pretty much been someone dies in every book. I don't go to the point of killing all my characters all at once yet, or I probably won't do that at all. I'm not sure quite yet. But the idea is there are a death in my books, so there's always this feeling of losing a character. So honestly, there are a lot of characters, both main characters and supporting characters, who I really would be it really would make me sad if they died. So yeah, I'm just emotionally attached to all of them. Let's just put it that way. Question from Gary Cole: do you think there's a bit of different feel with this book because it's the first to not begin with a NaNoWriMo draft? Um, Honestly, as the author, it's a little hard to tell. When you're in the middle of it, in the thick of it, you're observed with the nitty gritty, and you've seen it, and you've seen the books beginning from the beginning all the way to the end, so you know everything that went into the making of it. So like for example, I think book 4 was one of the hardest to write thus far, simply because I didn't have anything to go on off of previously, so I was kind of just having to make a concept and develop it without having any previous idea of what I really wanted besides notes. Um, I mean, as the author, I know what was harder for me to write and what was not. But from a reader's perspective, I don't think there is anything visibly different about this book than the others that sets it apart as something's different with this one because it wasn't a NaNoWriMo draft first. I don't think that's the case. I think it should be about the same as if I wrote it with a NaNoWriMo draft. But the writing process was totally different. Any other questions? Just as a side note here, some of my favorite non-fantasy novels um, are, because as a fantasy author, you would think that I would read only fantasy, but I typically don't. I read lots of different genres, from sci-fi to historical fiction to nonfiction, whatever it might be. But I really enjoyed Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. It's one of those books that gives avid readers this like unsettled feeling in their stomach. But it's it's a really good book. And then The Oath by Frank Peretti. That one I read on a road trip, and basically took me about 2 to 3 days to finish, and it's like this big. And then, of course, as a kid, I was always interested in the outdoors. So Gene Craighead George's My Side of the Mountain series was a favorite of mine. I haven't read it in a while, but I probably would want to read it again. It's kind of it's almost like the diary of a kid as he's living in the wilderness. And Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. It's a bit of a heavy read because it's old style and it's thick, and there's a lot of, as with most old literature, you have to slow down to read it. So that was a little hard to read, but I enjoyed that story. And of course, Jack London's Call of the Wild, White Fang, more childhood favorites. One recent book that I actually have really enjoyed was the Electrical Menagerie by Molly E. Reeder. So that was a really fun one. It's like a steampunk sort of story by a Christian author. Really, really fun story, full of humor and very thought-provoking. And then, of course, Citizen of the Galaxy by Robert Heinlein. That's a fun one. I really enjoyed that. Has almost a Star Wars kind of feel to it. And with characters, again, I try to make my characters consistent. So we have a question from Ashley. Have you based any characters off of people you know? I'm a little hesitant to answer this question because I've only really based one character off somebody I know. And I've been kind of wanting to keep it kind of a secret. But I did base one character in book 4 off of my younger brother. And I think he can kind of tell which character I'm talking about. But that was a fun one to kind of incorporate because it fit the character totally. So, but other than that, I don't actually base characters off of anybody I know. But like I said, there's a little bit of me in every character I write, so I'm almost seeing different sides of myself in every character that I write. So it's kind of an interesting mirror effect almost. Question from Glenn. What 2 pieces of advice would you give to someone wanting to write their first book? Oh man. Um, I would say before you even write, do your research, know what you're about, learn the craft first. And again, you're not going to get it right on your first try. That's just the nature of the beast. So, you don't have to do all like 2 years worth of research first before you even try. You do, I would say, more of doing research and learning the craft while you're writing. So I would, start out with short stories, novellas, things that aren't as large and as much of a commitment as a novel, but also enough to give you a time, good enough time to experiment. Um, and that's kind of, I would say, maybe my first advice. That would be the first step of advice I would give somebody. The second advice would be to read a lot. I know this is kind of cliche to say, to write you must first be an avid reader, but it really is true. Um, just because when you're writing out and when you're first starting writing, it's good to have an idea of what style you want to do, and naturally, whatever you read the most of will be what your writing style ends up being like. So, for example, I was reading Fahrenheit 451 not too long ago, and I was working on a short story, and I noticed that I started having more description, like, oh, did I say Heinlein? Robert, sorry, excuse me. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I found myself starting to write description more in a Bradbury style. It was very interesting. Um, so those would be my 2 pieces of advice for someone wanting to write their first book. Monica asks, what are your future plans for your podcast? Well, right now I just want to get episodes out there, and basically the whole idea of the Novelists Guild podcast is to kind of have a home for young writers to come learn about the craft in a very, short little snippets that you could have while, doing whatever, like maybe less than 10 minutes is what the episodes are happening to run right now. But they might grow a little longer than that, but around very short podcast episodes. So basically giving my listeners a shot in the arm as they're trying to learn the craft, and just provide a fun space where we can get together and just talk about writing. That's kind of what the podcast is about right now, and I'm hoping to release it out on a weekly basis. So I'm working on getting my backlog of episodes up. Jamila H asks, will we get any new animal characters? There is one new animal character in book 4 that I think you guys are going to really enjoy. But I do have some other animals lined up in the series. Of course, there's always going to be dragons in the books. There's been dragons repeatedly throughout the series. But I do want to have more creatures in the series, so there will be more. Yes. Oh, and back to the aspiring writer who wanted 2 pieces of advice for starting out writing. There is a resource ebook on my website for aspiring writers, giving some resources on self-publishing and writing and all these fun things. Well, and it's on my website. So if you actually go to the resources page, you can download that and see all the resources and stuff that I've used or have experience or knowledge of to kind of help kickstart your writing, your foray into the writing adventure. We got the drawing winners for the drawing. All right, so the first winner is Amy Holland, and the second winner is Cameron Taylor. Awesome. Congratulations, you guys. Please email me at jacksonegraham@gmail.com to collect your Amazon e-gift card, and I will contact you after confirming your email address as the winner. And we got one final question before we wrap this up from Micah. How did you decide how sentient to make Gibisil? And for those of you who don't know, sentient means having the intelligence or thinking capacity like a human. I would say Gibisil is not as intelligent as a human. It kind of has been fleshed out over the course of the series, but he's definitely very intelligent. So we see some of the creatures that exist nowadays that are really intelligent, and I kind of base Gibisil off of that sort of idea of animal intelligence. So I mean, he's not super sensing in like he can't read people's thoughts, but he can generally sense what people are wanting based on their mood and how they seem to be acting or speaking. He can't understand English, but he can kind of understand what different commands mean, like a dog would. So that's kind of the short answer to that question. So thanks for attending, everybody. Just a quick reminder, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and also subscribe to my website, my email, to stay up to date on my writing and my podcast releases. And again, self-publishers really depend on your feedback to help sell books. So I would really appreciate it if you would take the time to leave a review on Amazon for each Sword and Scion title. Again, glad you guys could all make it, and I hope you all have a great night. See you guys later, and I hope you all have a great night.